Fog presses against the city like a slow hand, and in 1860 New York breathes through it, restless and hungry. Ships creep along the rivers, bells cough across the water, and horses stamp on wet cobbles while lamps bloom and fade in the white air. Past the last row of houses, beyond new brick and old stone, a road slides into a thicket and then up a low hill with a wall. Behind the wall sits a square building of pale brick with blind windows and a cross that tilts as if tired. It has been shut for years, the latch green, the wood swollen, the name on its front rubbed down by rain and time. People do not come here to pray. They stop at the gate and pretend they came for the view. On some nights when the tide is high and the fog lifts into the trees, a sound rises from the building. It is not a scream and not quite a song. It is a low hum, steady and patient, like a thread pulled through cloth again and again. Those who live near the road say they hear faint chanting as if from a distant choir. A widow swears she saw light glide behind the upper windows, slow as a candle carried by a careful hand. A boy says he heard a bell that never rings in church, thin and regular as a watch. The constable will not take a statement. He says fog takes any shape it wants and sound rides it like a thief. He says the place was emptied long ago and left to rest, and the parish keeps it so. But the churchmen, when asked, look down the steps and change the talk to roof repairs. And the clerk closes a drawer with a calm face. Rumor moves faster than truth because rumor is lighter. It floats in taverns, tenements, and laundries. It finds work on the docks and in the ears of men who cannot sleep, and in the lips of children who dare one another to touch the gate. Those children come back with red fingers and big eyes and stories that loop. Stories about music without words and the soft click of beads. A night nurse from the charity ward says she cut across the hill at dawn and smelled candle smoke, boiled herbs, and something like iron. Another says a carriage came once at an hour when milk carts had not yet rolled, and that a figure in a dark coat went through the gate with a key and left empty-handed. These tales change shape, but they agree on one thing. The building is not empty. The city itself seems to feel it. When the wind shifts from the river, the fog pools along the wall and will not climb it. Dogs lower their heads and refuse the path. Crows keep to the far fence and watch in a tight, silent row. If there is fear here, it is not loud. It is orderly and neat, like a desk cleared at the end of the day. It is the kind of fear that waits, the kind that makes a person fold their hands and walk away without knowing why. Inside the city, life swells. Men argue about war and trade. Women queue at pumps, skirts heavy with rain. Ferries shudder. Newspapers spread talk of progress and plague in the same breath. The hill sits outside this talk like a skipped beat. The ledger at the convent was first raised as a place of mercy, a stone house at the edge of the city meant to cradle women whom the world named broken. They were called sufferers of melancholy, of fits, of voices that spoke from nowhere. Families sent their daughters here when marriage failed or shame clung too close. The parish spoke kindly of it, a sanctuary where troubled minds would be soothed by prayer and simple labor. At least that was the claim. Behind its walls, the truth was a quieter thing, and silence soon became its truest voice. The Sisters of St. Dymphna welcomed women who were too wild, too sad, too fractured, and set them to work in gardens and laundries. Yet beneath this rhythm of order, another presence grew. The building itself seemed to know the difference between care and containment, between healing and hiding. It held its patience like a throat holds a swallowed stone. Among the first to keep its records was a young priest named Elias Moran. His handwriting filled the ledgers in neat lines, each admission marked with a date, a note of behavior, and a closing remark in calm Latin. He was admired in the parish for his gentleness. Parishioners described him as soft-voiced, always patient. willing to stand in the rain if a widow needed her grief heard. He walked with measured steps and always carried his rosary wound tight around his fingers as though every moment of his life was bound to prayer. To most he appeared as a model of pastoral care, a man whose devotion to God was total. But the words he left behind, in the private margins of those records, revealed another truth. Elias had a mind drawn not to mercy but to pattern. He believed every human fault could be mapped like scripture, each tremor of madness a sign of divine arithmetic. He recorded the women's sufferings with precision, noting the intervals between their cries, the length of time they could be made to kneel before collapsing, the days they could go without speaking when locked apart from the others. What the sisters thought of as discipline, Elias quietly wrote as an experiment. He believed pain was a language that God had hidden within the body, and that by studying its rhythm he might learn what ordinary priests could not. The convent slowly took on his vision. Beds were placed in exact rows, each patient seated at identical angles during meals, each prayer measured by the same count of breaths. When the women faltered, Elias wrote that their disorder was a failure of will, and he prescribed longer silences, darker rooms, smaller rations. He said these things to the sisters with the calm certainty of a doctor recommending medicine, and in their obedience they allowed it. What they did not see was the quiet hunger that grew in him as he watched their bodies bend under the weight of his instructions. To him their misery was not only tolerable, it was sacred. It proved his method worked. Yet beneath his still exterior, a more secret belief took hold. Elias convinced himself that madness itself was not an illness, but a door. He wrote in the margins of his journals that broken minds were nearer to God than sound ones because they could hear what others could not. If pain could open the mind, then pain was not cruelty but key. And if he, a priest, could master the turning of that key, then he was not merely a shepherd but an architect of holiness. The ledger ceased to be a record of patience and became line by line a scripture of his own invention. From the outside, the convent remained what it had always been, a quiet house of care on the edge of the city, its windows shuttered, its bells rung only on feast days. Families continued to send their daughters, and parishioners continued to believe in the work being done within. But behind its wall, under the careful watch of Father Elias Moran, the true nature of St. Dymphna shifted. It was no longer a place of healing but of calculation, a chamber where suffering was measured with the same devotion others gave to prayer. And in the shadows of those first records, a pattern began to form, one that would not stop until the convent's silence became complete. To the parish, Father Elias Moran was a man of quiet goodness. He walked the streets with a bowed head and an open hand, stopping to bless sick children, lingering to lift sacks for widows too thin to carry them alone. He seemed to belong to the city as much as its bells and its smoke. He never raised his voice, never hurried, never spoke with bitterness. People described his face as calm, almost tender, and his smile was the kind that reassured those around him that their burdens had been noticed and would be carried upward in prayer. Mothers sent their daughters to confession without fear, trusting his patient silence. Men nodded to him at taverns as if he were their better conscience. In the daylight he appeared an anchor of goodness, a model of devotion wrapped in gentleness. Yet in the still rooms of the convent, where no one came uninvited, his hands shaped another truth. His notebooks were kept under lock, bound in plain covers that gave no hint of the contents within. To a careless eye, they might seem like ledgers of parish duties or records of supply. But between their pages his real devotion took form. Elias wrote with a precision that bordered on the unnatural, his letters identical, his numbers exact. He tracked every woman under his care as if they were experiments in a grand design. The hours of their silence, The angle of their spines when kneeling, the rate of their breathing when denied water, each detail marked, each result compared. To him there was no cruelty here. It was ordered. He believed that order was holiness, and disorder was sin given shape in the flesh. What he called punishment he renamed as cleansing. What he called isolation he wrote as purification. He saw pain not as a wound but as a mirror, revealing the hidden stain inside every human being. The sisters of the convent mistook his methods for discipline, and perhaps they wanted to believe in him as much as the parish did. When Elias instructed longer fasts, they obeyed. When he demanded that the women rise before dawn to kneel on bare stone, they saw it as harsh but holy. The sisters heard the crying behind closed doors but trusted his explanation that these were necessary trials, part of a spiritual cure. His words were calm, never frantic, spoken with the ease of a man certain of his righteousness. That certainty was his mask, and beneath it lived a hunger for control that grew sharper with every season. In his private reflections, Elias wrote of purity as if it were a number, a precise balance to be reached through suffering. He believed the body was an instrument that must be tuned, each nerve and tendon stretched until it produced the correct note of obedience. He convinced himself that God had chosen him alone to hear this hidden music. When a woman's will broke, when her voice thinned to whispers and her eyes dulled with exhaustion, Elias wrote that the melody had been revealed. He described these states with a devotion that other priests reserved for Scripture, as if the collapse of a human soul was not tragedy but revelation. He hid this obsession well. In public sermons, his words carried warmth, urging kindness, patience, and charity. He smiled at children and spoke of heaven in tones that soothed the weary. Nuns saw how carefully he studied the eyes of his listeners, how he counted their blinks, how he imagined the pressure points beneath their skin. For Elias, every soul was both a burden to be lifted and a specimen to be examined. Behind his gentle face there lived a man who did not seek comfort for the broken, but rather the perfecting of the broken through ritual torment. The convent became the ground where his twin faces met. By day he was the patient priest who held the hands of grieving mothers. By night he was the keeper of silence, the architect of punishments disguised as cures. His madness wore the robes of piety, his cruelty spoke with the cadence of prayer. And as his notebooks grew heavier, filled with exact lines and careful diagrams, so too did his conviction that he was not a man of mercy at all, but a chosen surgeon of the soul. What the world saw as kindness was only the outer skin of something older, darker, and far more deliberate. And in the deep quiet of St. Dymphna, the mask would soon slip, though no one beyond its gates yet knew it. They came to the convent as so many had before them, young women drawn by the promise of safety, of clean beds and prayerful quiet, of distance from the noise and shame of the city. Some were sent by families who could no longer manage their tears or their fits. Others came willingly, believing a holy life could steady their restless minds. The sisters welcomed them with soft hands and lowered eyes, speaking of discipline and peace. Behind the altar, Father Elias Moran observed each new arrival with the patience of a shepherd. He spoke kindly, praised their faith, and marked their names into his ledger with neat, unbroken strokes. To the sisters, his guidance seemed protective. To the women, his presence was a comfort. To Elias himself, each new voice was another thread in the fabric of his secret work, another body upon which the hidden arithmetic of suffering could be tested. At first the corrections appeared small, meals thinned until hunger sharpened their senses. Hours of silence stretched longer, filling the convent with a hush that pressed against the ears. Sleep was shortened, with bells rung before dawn until their eyes reddened from strain. The sisters were told these measures would bring focus and devotion. That exhaustion stripped away the noise of temptation. and for a time it seemed harmless, for the women endured as many before them had. But Elias watched closely, and in the pages of his notebooks he wrote not of faith but of endurance, measuring the point where the body's strength faltered and the will gave way. To him, each collapse was not failure but revelation. The first death came almost unnoticed. A young novice named Clara had knelt too long in the chapel, her body locked upright in prayer until her chest failed her. When the sisters found her, they wept, but Elias wrote calmly that she had offered herself as proof of devotion, that her silence was perfect. He instructed that her body not be laid in the ground but left in her seat, hands folded, head bowed. The sisters obeyed, uncertain but trusting. Soon others followed, not through blows or blades, but through the slow erasure of the self, fasting that thinned the blood, isolation that gnawed at reason, breathless nights on stone floors where lungs struggled until they did not. Elias called these deaths his first choir, their silence a hymn louder than any voice. What unsettled the sisters was not only the deaths themselves, but how the bodies remained. Elias treated them as if they were not gone, arranging them in the chapel as though still in prayer. Wax and herbs masked the smell, while the fog that drifted through the halls kept the air cool. Visitors who passed the doors of St. Dymphna sometimes glimpsed the figures through the cracked wood and mistook them for living nuns at devotion. None questioned why their faces seemed pale, why their lips did not move. Elias smiled when they did not ask, his deception hidden behind the appearance of perfect order. The women who remained alive grew quieter. They began to fear speaking, fearing their voices might draw his attention. Their silence pleased Elias most of all. He wrote that words were a waste, that the truest song was the absence of sound. Each time a woman failed to speak, each time she bowed her head in trembling obedience, Elias noted the progress of his design. He had no need to strike them, for their bodies betrayed them in time. Hunger softened them, sleeplessness blurred their thoughts, solitude cut their voices away. When they finally stilled, he arranged them among the others, a circle of bowed heads facing the altar, a congregation of the dead mistaken for the devout. By the time the sisters began to sense something was wrong, it was already too late. The choir had grown too large, its silence too heavy. They felt it when walking the halls, as if unseen eyes followed their steps. The convent no longer echoed with voices or laughter, only with the hum of Elias's order, a rhythm too precise to be holy. Yet the parish outside saw nothing amiss. They spoke of the convent as blessed, remarking how peaceful its windows looked, how faithfully its women kept their prayers. They did not know those prayers had ceased, and that the silence they praised was not devotion but death. Inside St. Dymphna, Father Elias Moran sat with his ledger open, adding neat lines beneath the names of the fallen, satisfied that the choir of silence was at last beginning to take shape. The silence of the choir did not satisfy Elias for long. Stillness was holy, but it did not answer the deeper questions gnawing at him. He had come to believe that pain was a language, but he wanted more than its words. He wanted its grammar, its rules, its mathematics. If the body was an instrument, then blood was the ink in which God wrote his secret scripture. To uncover that scripture, Elias built the chamber. It began with simple tools: vials borrowed from apothecaries, jars of herbs, metal clamps taken from a blacksmith who thought he was supplying hinges. But soon Elias demanded more precision. He sought glass not for windows but for veins. He convinced himself that the soul flowed with the blood, and by guiding that flow through his own hands, he could observe its pattern. The chamber was hidden beneath the convent, in a stone room where the walls were damp and the air never moved. The sisters knew nothing of its true purpose. They were told it was a place for medicine and correction. But when the door closed, Elias transformed the women into what he called living hourglasses. Glass tubes were slipped into their veins, clear and delicate, carrying their blood out and back again in slow arcs that caught the dim light. He watched the rhythm of their pulses through the tubes, watched the dark red rise and fall like sand in an hourglass, counting each drop as though it marked time itself. Their suffering was no longer random. It became ordered, measured, a sacred experiment that he alone could understand. The women wept at first, their voices thin in the cold stone room, but their cries faded into silence as the hours wore on. Elias wrote that this was the purest form of obedience, when even screams exhausted themselves and left only the breathless body behind. He called the tubes veins of glass, and to him they were more beautiful than stained windows because they showed the truth of God's design without disguise. He recorded the exact minutes a woman could endure before fainting, the precise volume drained before her lips turned pale, the interval of her heartbeat as it weakened under the strain. Each number was written into his notebook as though it were scripture. The sisters who carried the women back afterward told themselves that Elias had treated them, that he was finding new cures. They saw only the faint marks left on the skin and heard only his calm words about purging sickness from the body. They could not imagine the truth, that their sisters had been made into vessels of arithmetic, their torment bent into neat equations that meant nothing to anyone but Elias. The chamber remained secret, its air heavy with the metallic scent of blood, its stone floor marked with stains that never fully dried. Outside the walls of the convent, the village heard nothing. The screams that did escape the chamber were muffled by stone and swallowed by fog. At most, a passerby might hear a strange hum or the faint ring of glass, and they told themselves it was the wind in the trees or the sound of water through pipes. No one dared question further. The church was holy, and holiness was not to be doubted. Meanwhile, Elias grew convinced he had unlocked the first steps of a divine formula. He wrote that endurance could be measured, that the body was a clock wound by suffering, and that every collapse was not death but revelation. In the chamber of glass veins, life and death became experiments, each body a vessel emptied and refilled until silence overtook it. Elias looked upon these broken women not as victims but as instruments perfected by his hand, and as he closed his ledger after each trial, he smiled with the calm certainty of a man who believed he was not harming souls but elevating them into eternity. Above, the convent remained quiet, the dead arranged in prayer, the living walking softly past them. Below, in the dark stone chamber, the slow counting of drops continued, a hidden hymn written not in voice but in blood. Elias's hunger deepened once the chamber of glass veins had given him what he called numbers of the soul. To him, simple endurance was not enough. He began to believe that suffering did not end with death, that the body after life was still a vessel waiting to be tuned. In his eyes, death was not a final silence but a doorway to a higher form of worship, and the bodies left behind were instruments meant for him to shape. What others would have called desecration, Elias renamed as ritual. He believed himself to be a craftsman of holiness, and the convent his workshop of eternity. The first transformation was small, almost hidden. A young sister who perished in silence was not buried but brought to the altar. Elias removed her bones with careful hands, not in haste or frenzy but with the calm of a surgeon. He ground them into a fine dust, mixing them with salt from the convent's kitchen. To the sisters who saw the pale powder spread in a thin line across the altar, he spoke of purification. In truth, he believed each particle carried a fragment of the soul's endurance, and that by scattering them, he was consecrating the room with their suffering. The line of bone and salt became his first hymn, invisible to outsiders but sacred in his mind, a score written in dust. From there, the rituals grew darker. Skin was peeled with patience and stretched thin, dried until it could be inscribed upon. Elias wrote verses of his own invention on these sheets, prayers that did not come from Scripture but from the twisted liturgy that bloomed in his private notebooks. He believed these words, written on the very flesh of those who had endured his trials, could be sung by angels beyond human hearing. The sisters who stumbled upon the sheets thought they had animal hides prepared for repair work, never daring to read what was carved into them. Their obedience allowed the deception to continue, and Elias moved deeper into his work with the certainty of a man who believed God himself had ordained it. Each body became a relic of its own kind. Skulls were hollowed and filled with salt, arranged on shelves in patterns only Elias could understand. Fingers were bound with thread and hung like rosaries, each joint a bead, each chain a reminder of silence. He took the organs and packed them with herbs, storing them in jars as though they were sacred oils. What others would call grotesque, Elias recorded as sacred inventory. He believed every fragment of a body held a note, and when arranged correctly, the dead together formed a symphony. In the still chapel, the arrangement of the corpses became another ritual. He placed them in postures of prayer, bowing or kneeling as if caught mid-hymn. Visitors who saw them through cracked doors assumed they were living nuns locked in devotion. The trick worked too well. No one wished to disturb such piety, and so the truth remained hidden. To Elias, their stillness was not concealment but performance. He believed that when the light of dawn touched their wax-coated faces, the silent hymn rose upward, heard not by human ears but by the God he thought demanded this offering. His notebooks became more fevered, though still neat, each letter perfectly aligned. He wrote of choirs that did not need lungs, of psalms etched into bone, of a music more enduring than breath. He called it his sacred symphony, and he believed that each act of ritual dismemberment added another instrument to it. The sisters who assisted him saw only fragments of his work, never the whole, and thus their conscience remained untouched. They carried water, prepared cloth, fetched herbs, thinking they served medicine, not madness. Outside the convent, the world moved on, unaware. Bells tolled for wars abroad, merchants haggled in markets, children played in the fog. No one guessed that in the quiet building on the hill, an orchestra of the dead was being arranged, each body a note, each alteration a verse. Elias walked among them with serene satisfaction, his gentle smile unchanged. To the parish he was still the kind priest, calm and patient. But in the chapel, among his bone dust and hymn sheets of skin, he was something else entirely. A composer writing in flesh, building a symphony of silence that only he and his God would ever hear. Elias knew that silence alone could not protect his work forever. Rumors grew restless, and even the sisters had begun to shift uneasily under the weight of what they carried out for him without questions. Death left traces, and though he had turned bodies into relics, the fragility of flesh threatened to betray him. He could not allow decay to shatter the illusion of devotion. If the parish ever stepped too close, if officials ever demanded entry, they must see not corpses but faithful women at prayer. And so Elias turned his attention to preservation. In his mind, this was not concealment but perfection. If suffering had purified their souls, then their bodies should remain in eternal worship, never betraying the weakness of rot. He convinced himself that he was giving them a gift, not burial but permanence. Wax became his new scripture. He melted it down in iron pots stolen from the kitchens, blending it with herbs, resins, and oils. The fumes filled the lower rooms, heavy and sweet, clinging to walls until even the sisters felt faint when they passed. Elias experimented with mixtures until he found one that sealed flesh into something neither living nor entirely dead. He brushed the wax across faces, coating lips, eyelids, and skin, smoothing every mark of decay. With patience, he painted life back onto them, not warm and breathing, but still and unchanging. To him it was holiness distilled into form, a body locked forever in prayer, a vessel of silence that could no longer betray him. When the first of these preserved figures was placed in the chapel, Elias stood before it for hours. The nun sat with folded hands, head bowed, her face glistening under the thin layer of wax. In the dim candlelight, she appeared only tired, her stillness mistaken for deep prayer. Even up close, only the faint smell of resin betrayed the truth. Elias smiled, satisfied that the illusion was stronger than the living body had ever been. For the living faltered, broke under hunger or fatigue, but these waxen worshippers did not. They knelt without wavering, their spines straight, their silence absolute. One by one he transformed them. Some were seated in pews, others arranged at the altar steps. A few were placed in the cloister gardens, hands clasped, eyes lowered as if in endless contemplation. The sisters dared not question him, for his words framed the grotesque as holy. He said they were martyrs honored in death, their devotion preserved for eternity. Many wanted to believe it because to admit the truth would mean confessing that they had been complicit. And so they lowered their eyes and obeyed, letting the convent fill with waxen faces that never spoke, never moved, never rotted. The deception proved effective. When parish officials came to inspect the convent, concerned about whispers of illness and overcrowding, Elias led them through the chapel with calm confidence. They saw rows of nuns bowed in devotion, their waxen faces shining softly in the candlelight. The officials whispered about such discipline, such piety, never once daring to disturb a figure so still. They left praising Elias for his guidance, noting in their reports that St. Dymphna's convent was a place of remarkable order. What they had seen were corpses embalmed by madness, but their eyes had been fooled by the illusion of holiness. The wax had not only sealed the dead abandonment, it had sealed suspicion itself. In his journals, Elias wrote of this as his greatest triumph. He said the preserved were not corpses but vessels of eternal liturgy, their silence more profound than any living song. He recorded the hours it took to coat each body, the blend of herbs that masked the faint scent of rot, the temperature at which the wax hardened best. His notes read like hymns, but they were recipes of decay turned into art. He no longer saw the convent as a house for healing, but as a gallery, a choir frozen in place, each waxen facing another voice in his growing symphony. The village continued to speak of the convent as a place of peace. From the road they saw still figures through the windows. Women bowed in prayer, and they assumed the work of God thrived within. They did not know the truth that what they praised as devotion was only death arranged as spectacle. Inside, Elias walked among them with the same gentle smile he wore in the streets, pausing before each waxen sister as if listening to a hymn no one else could hear. And in the silence that filled the chapel, he believed he had achieved eternity. A choir without decay, a congregation without end, a sanctuary where death itself had been trained into obedience. Sister Agnes arrived at the convent on a gray morning, her dress damp from travel and her eyes still swollen from nights of weeping. She had come in search of peace, fleeing a home that had turned against her, believing that St. Dymphna's house would offer sanctuary. The sisters welcomed her with soft words, yet behind their faces lingered an unease she could not name. The halls smelled of resin and herbs, and though she was told the convent was full, the silence pressed against her ears as if every room were empty. Agnes bowed her head and prayed, but even in her first hours she sensed something beneath the walls, something breathing without sound. She was struck most by the stillness of her new sisters. In the chapel, rows of women sat bowed, hands folded in perfect prayer, but none stirred when she passed. Their faces shone strangely, pale and rigid, their eyes unblinking no matter how long she waited. At first she thought they were lost in holy rapture, yet when her candlelight touched their cheeks, the skin glistened like wax, not flesh. She whispered a greeting, but no reply came, and her voice died in the thick silence. When she asked Father Elias about them, he smiled gently and said they had reached a higher devotion, a silence she too would one day understand. His words were soft, his tone reassuring, but Agnes felt the cold edge beneath them, as if every syllable were a lock turning on a door she could not see. Unlike the others before her, Agnes did not surrender easily to the order of the house. She lay awake at night listening for footsteps, for the faint hum that drifted through the stones, for the sound of glass clinking far below. Her fear sharpened her senses, and the more she observed, the clearer the deception became. She saw the wax at the corner of lips, the herbs packed too neatly at the base of throats, and the strange patterns of bone dust traced across the altar. She began to realize that the convent was not a refuge but a theater of the dead. Every figure around her an actor fixed in a role they could never leave. Elias, meanwhile, saw in Agnes what he had been waiting for. Her sharpness, her suspicion, her refusal to fold into silence marked her as different. In his notebooks, he named her not as another subject, but as his perfect vessel. The others had broken too quickly, too easily. She would resist, and her resistance would make the ritual stronger. He wrote that through her he would compose his final hymn, one not of silence alone, but of memory itself erased. For Agnes there would be no simple death, no waxen disguise. She would become the climax of his symphony, the sacrifice upon which his illusion of eternity would be sealed. And though she did not yet know it, the careful gaze that followed her every step was already choosing her place in the circle of the dead. For Elias, Sister Agnes was not another subject to be bent and broken. She was the final piece, the vessel he believed had been chosen for him. He had written of 17 sacraments before, each one a method of purging the soul through suffering. But none had yet achieved what he desired. The waxen faces in the chapel, the relics of bone and salt, the glass veins that sang in silence, all of these were preludes. In Agnes he saw not weakness but resistance, and in that resistance he imagined a key that could open the last door. He began to write of a new ritual, one that he called the 18th sacrament, a passage not of flesh but of mind. In this rite he would not drain blood, nor tear skin, nor break bone. He would strip away memory itself until the soul was naked and without history, a perfect vessel emptied of all noise. The preparation was exact. Elias cleared a stone chamber beneath the convent, sealing it so no sound could enter or leave. He built what he called a sensory coffin, a narrow box lined with heavy cloth, its lid layered with wax to block all traces of light, its hinges padded to kill every echo. Into this space he would place Agnes, not to kill her body quickly, but to erase the world around her until her mind collapsed. He told himself that this was the purest offering, a soul unchained from memory, unshaped by anything but his hand. When the time came, Agnes was led into the chamber under the pretense of confession. She carried suspicion in her eyes, but she obeyed, perhaps still holding a thread of hope that there was sanctuary to be found. Elias's smile did not falter. He spoke softly, assuring her of purification, of reaching a silence beyond all earthly pain. His words, as always, were tender, yet each syllable tightened the snare. She was guided into the coffin, her body laid flat, her hands folded as though already in prayer. The lid closed above her with a soundless finality, and darkness swallowed her whole. At first Agnes fought against the stillness. She tried to count the seconds, to mark the rhythm of her own breathing, to remember the sound of her own name. But the box gave her nothing. No light, no sound, no texture beyond the smothering cloth against her skin. The silence pressed deeper than any scream. Time unraveled, thought drifted. Her memories, once clear, began to scatter. She tried to recall the faces of her family, the streets of her childhood, the reasons she had come here, but each slipped away like sand through open hands. In Elias's notes, he wrote that her mind was breaking in perfect rhythm, that each stage of her collapse was another verse in the symphony. Hours became days. Elias opened the coffin only to feed her thin drops of water, only enough to keep her body alive while her mind unraveled. He recorded the moments when she no longer responded to her own name, when she forgot the act of swallowing, when her lips moved without words as though chasing memories already gone. He watched her eyes glaze into emptiness, and he believed he was seeing the soul detach from the prison of history. In her collapse, he heard what he called the final hymn, not sound, but the absence of everything, a silence so complete he believed even God must be listening. When Agnes at last ceased to breathe, Elias did not see death. He saw perfection. He opened the coffin and gazed at her face, now slack and pale, and in his mind she was not a victim but the vessel of his greatest work. He wrote that the 18th sacrament had been achieved, that memory itself had been conquered, that in erasing her he had created a soul free of all worldly stains. He arranged her among the waxen sisters, placing her at the center of the chapel as though she were leading the eternal prayer. To anyone who might look inside, she was only another figure in silent devotion. But to Elias, she was the crown of his symphony, the proof that his work had reached its final note. Above the chamber, the fog pressed close against the convent walls, carrying with it the faint hum of silence that no villager could explain. They told themselves it was only the wind. But Elias knew it was the sound of his triumph, the hymn of memory erased, the 18th sacrament complete. When Sister Agnes was laid among the others, Elias felt the circle close. His ledger was full, his formulas complete, and in his mind the symphony had reached its highest note. Yet the perfection he believed he had achieved also left him with nothing more to build. His madness had run its full course, and in its wake there came a strange calm. For days he drifted through the convent like a shadow, no longer writing, no longer instructing, only watching the waxen faces in the chapel as though waiting for them to rise. The sisters avoided his eyes, moving in silence through their duties, too frightened to speak, yet too bound to leave. Outside, the fog thickened along the hill, as if the world itself had decided to seal the house in a curtain no hand could lift. Then one morning Elias was simply gone. His bed lay untouched, his robe folded neatly at its foot, his rosary placed carefully atop the ledger he had once guarded like scripture. No door had been forced, no gate unlatched. It was as if he had dissolved into the air, carried off by the silence he had worshipped. The sisters left behind did not search for him. Their fear had grown into something larger than grief or loyalty. It was resignation. They closed the doors of the chapel, barred the windows, and one by one abandoned their duties. No one came to replace them. No records were signed. The convent's life collapsed inward until it was nothing but locked doors, and the still bodies Elias had left posed in prayer. The parish noticed only that the convent had fallen quiet. Supplies were no longer requested, letters no longer sent. When questioned, the officials told themselves that the order had dissolved or moved elsewhere. And in time they stopped asking. Yet villagers who walked near the hill began to whisper strange sounds in the fog. They said that faint hymns drifted down the path at night, voices soft and steady carrying a melody that no one could place. Some swore they saw light glowing behind the windows, a pale shimmer that moved slowly from figure to figure. Children dared one another to touch the gate, and when they returned, they spoke of hearing footsteps behind the wall, though no one appeared. As the years passed, legend hardened around the convent like stone. It was said that the sisters had chosen to seal themselves inside, vowing eternal silence, and that their prayers rose still, carried into the sky by fog. Others whispered of punishment, that their vow had gone wrong and their silence was a curse. None dared enter to test the truth. The door remained locked, the windows shuttered, the gate chained. In time, even the church ceased to mention St. Dymphna at all, as though forgetting the name might erase its shadow. But forgetting did not silence the hum. On nights when the wind stilled, it could be heard again, faint and low, a chorus that grew no louder no matter how close one walked. Inside, the bodies remained where Elias had placed them, their waxen faces forever bowed, their hands folded in perfect devotion. Dust settled on their shoulders like ash, but their silence did not break. The chamber below held its stains, the coffin its emptiness, the ledgers their perfect lines. Elias's touch lingered in every room, in every arrangement, as if he had not left at all, but had only stepped into the silence itself. For the living who passed outside, the building was nothing more than an empty shell. But for those who dared to listen, it was something else, a choir without breath, a prayer without end, a house that refused to release the dead it had been given. The convent stood untouched for decades, its doors sealed, its name fading from records until it was little more than a rumor in the parish, a shadow in the fog. Yet the legend endured. People said the sisters still sang within, their voices neither alive nor dead, bound in eternal devotion. No one knew that what echoed in the stone halls was not prayer, but the residue of Elias Moran's madness, a symphony composed of silence, memory, and death. And as the decades passed, the hum never ceased, waiting for the day when the doors would open and the truth would finally step into the light. By the dawn of the new century, the convent was a ruin on the hill, sealed so long that even the church had allowed its name to fade into rumor. Ivy climbed its pale brick, windows sagged with rot, and its gate hung crooked, chained shut with iron that had fused into itself. For most in the growing city below, St. Dymphna was only a story told to children, a place whispered of but never entered. Yet in 1902, progress demanded space, and the convent's land was chosen for renovation. Workmen came with tools, their boots crunching across the wet grass, their hammers striking the swollen wood of doors that had not opened in more than 40 years. When the lock broke, the sound was like a scream, sharp and echoing, as if the building itself protested its violation. Dust rolled out in thick sheets, and with it came the smell of resin, wax, and something older, something the men could not name. They pushed their way inside with lanterns, light quivering across walls that seemed untouched by time. What they expected was rot, collapse, vermin nests and broken pews. What they found instead stopped them where they stood. In the chapel, seated in rows as though frozen mid-prayer, were 18 women. Their bodies were upright, their hands folded neatly against their laps, their faces pale and glistening under a thin coat of wax. Some leaned forward on elbows, as though caught in devotion, others sat straight as stone. Their eyes, unblinking, reflected the lantern light with a lifeless gleam. The men did not speak at first. They stared in disbelief, for it seemed impossible that these figures could be anything but alive. Yet the longer they looked, the more wrongness crept into their sight. The wax had cracked at the corners of lips. The herbs packed at the base of throats had dried into black threads. The skin beneath was shriveled, but preserved. These women had been dead for decades, and yet they remained in perfect order, untouched by decay. The still air of the convent held them in a silence so heavy that even the workers lowered their voices as if afraid to disturb a service still in progress. Word spread quickly, but not far. Officials arrived, their faces pale as the lanterns revealed the circle of preserved sisters. Reports were written in hurried script, noting not only the strange condition of the bodies, but the journals scattered on shelves, written in immaculate hands, pages filled with diagrams and careful numbers. Some spoke of bone dust found lining the altar, others of jars sealed with herbs and organs inside. Yet these details soon disappeared. Files were collected, sealed, and locked away. Newspapers carried only the faintest mention, describing the convent as abandoned, its residents lost long ago. The truth of what was discovered inside those walls never reached the public. It was not only horror that was hidden, but shame. For those who had walked the halls, however, the memory never left. They recalled the feeling that the bodies were not simply corpses, but watchers. They remembered how the wax caught the light like skin damp with prayer, how the air seemed filled not with silence, but with the residue of a hymn that would not end. Some swore they heard faint chanting when they first entered, a low murmur like voices caught in stone. Others described the sense that Father Elias Moran himself was still present, his gaze lingering in the rooms, even if his body was nowhere to be found. The convent was locked again soon after, its doors sealed under the weight of official orders. Those who had stepped inside carried the burden of what they saw in private, speaking of it only in hushed tones. They knew they had not uncovered a simple ruin, but the remains of a ritual, a masterpiece of devotion twisted into eternal silence. The women they found were not resting. They had been arranged into a tableau, a choir frozen at the height of its hymn, their waxen faces lifted toward a God that had never answered. The world outside moved forward into the modern age, electric lamps lighting the streets, new buildings climbing higher, carriages replaced by engines. But on the hill, behind chained gates, the chapel of St. Dymphna remained sealed, holding its congregation of the dead in perfect order. To some, the discovery was a forgotten curiosity. To others, it was proof that evil could outlast even time itself, waiting in silence until the day another lock would break. The journals surfaced by accident, decades after the discovery of the convent's waxen choir. They were found in a forgotten drawer of a church archive, wrapped in plain cloth and sealed with brittle wax. At first glance, they seemed ordinary, the handwriting neat and steady, the bindings unmarked. Yet when opened, the calm script revealed a mind laid bare, not with rage or madness spilling across the page, but with the patience of a man who believed every stroke of ink was a sacred act. These were not confessions in the sense of guilt, but in the sense of revelation, Elias speaking across time to whoever might one day unlock his words. Page after page unfolded with a chilling steadiness. He did not write as a murderer, but as a scholar, recording experiments with dates, outcomes, and observations as though he were cataloging cures. He described fasting not as deprivation, but as purification, noting the precise day a woman's silence overtook her hunger. He explained the chamber of glass veins with diagrams, showing blood looping through clear tubes as if the soul itself could be made visible. He detailed the preparation of wax mixtures, the blend of herbs to slow decay, the temperatures at which faces could be sealed into devotion forever. Each entry carried no tremor of doubt, only the serene conviction that he had been chosen to uncover a higher truth. Most disturbing were the passages he called hymns of correction. These were not music, but formulas, combinations of suffering he believed produced harmony. He spoke of silence as a note, hunger as a chord, isolation as a rhythm. Each nun who collapsed under his hand was not written as a death, but as a completed verse in a growing composition. He referred to the dead not by their names, but as instruments, string, drum, pipe, each altered to contribute to his imagined symphony. The choir he built in wax and bone was described as eternal, their silence carried upward as sound only heaven could receive. In his calm script, cruelty was not cruelty at all, but order, refinement, even devotion. What unsettled the archivists who first read these words was not only the detail but the tone. Elias never sounded frenzied. There were no wild crossings out, no bursts of rage. His handwriting was even, the margins clean, his thoughts organized into steps. Evil here did not roar. It whispered with discipline. It was the voice of a man who smiled as he wrote, who believed the destruction of human beings was not sin but service. His journals revealed that beneath the gentlest exterior had lived a methodical obsession, a mind so steady that it made horror feel inevitable, as if it were only the next line of scripture. The pages were quickly sealed again, moved into hidden archives where few would ever see them. The church feared scandal, the state feared unrest. Officially they were lost, but those who held them for even a moment carried a memory that would not leave. The sight of steady ink describing the unmaking of lives. The way calm handwriting could contain a madness colder than fire. For Elias Moran had left no scream behind him, only the quiet trace of his pen. And in those lines the true nature of his evil was clear, not chaos but patience, a cruelty so calm it felt almost divine. The ruins of St. Dymphna did not vanish when the bodies were buried. The convent stood like an open wound on the hill, its walls heavy with memory, its silence louder than bells. Officials spoke of closure, but the city never forgot the sight of 18 women seated in eternal prayer, their faces sealed in wax. Families came with questions. Why their daughters never returned, why the church's answers were clipped and cold. They were given no names, no records, only reassurances that the sisters had been laid to rest. Yet grief does not settle when truth is denied. It lingers, sour and heavy, twisting into rumor. The church carried the stain of St. Dymphna like a curse. Priests whispered of it only in fragments, and chapels once dedicated to her patronage were quietly renamed. Some called the convent a punishment, others a shame better buried. Still, the shadow of Elias Moran spread further than silence could contain. His journals, diagrams, and hymns of correction did not burn with the bodies. They were hidden instead, studied in secret, their patient cruelty dissected by those who wished to understand or to repeat. And so the legacy of the preserved was twofold: grief above ground, and in archives below, a seed of methodical evil waiting in silence. Evil does not always announce itself with rage or fire. At St. Dymphna it wore a gentle smile, a calm voice, and the steady patience of a man who claimed to heal while he quietly destroyed it. Elias Moran showed that cruelty can hide in plain sight, disguised as care, dressed in the robes of devotion. His victims did not fall in chaos, but in silence, arranged as if still praying, their suffering transformed into the illusion of holiness. It was not madness that guided his hand, but method, order, and a belief that his rituals were sacred. That is what makes his story most disturbing. It was not loud. It was not wild. It was calm. The preserved sisters remain a haunting reminder that evil does not need to shout to thrive. It waits in institutions, in authority, in the trust people surrender to gentle voices. It feeds on silence, on the willingness of others to look away. The convent may have been sealed, the bodies buried, the files hidden, but the lesson is not locked away. It lingers, heavy and unanswerable. And so the question remains, what do you think? Could this happen again behind walls we choose not to open?